2022 Eugene Planning Commission meeting. My name is Dan.
Recording in progress.
I am the chair of the commission, and I'd like to call this meeting to order. Thank you for joining us in this virtual meeting format. This format enables the Planning Commission to meet and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. Anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website or the broadcast on Comcast Channel 27, or by joining the Zoom link. Today, our meeting will be to begin by the city's land acknowledgement statement, and I will pass over to Alyssa to read that for us. Alyssa.
Hold on just a second. I had it up. Here we go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alyssa Hanson, and I'm Eugene's planning director, and I will read the land acknowledgement statement. Since time immemorial, the Kaliapaya Indian people have been the indigenous stewards of our region, building dynamic communities, maintaining balance with wildlife, and enacting sustainable land practices. This land acknowledgement is a way of resisting the erasure of indigenous histories and to honor Native communities by inviting truth and reconciliation. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kaliapaya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. As we consider the impacts of colonization, we also acknowledge the strength and resiliency of displaced indigenous people. The city of Eugene is built within the traditional homelands known as the Kaliapaya Ilahi. Kaliapaya descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. They continue to make contributions in our communities here and across the lands. We express our respect for the inherent political sovereignty of all federally recognized tribal nations and indigenous people who live in the state of Oregon and across the nation. Therefore, the Planning Commission and staff recognize that what we do today will affect the many generations who will come after us.
Thanks, Alyssa. After our first agenda item is deliberations on urban reserves, and I'll turn that back over to Rebecca Gershow for a staff presentation. Rebecca.
Thank you, Commissioner Isaacson, and all of the Eugene Planning Commission. I appreciate you having me here today. I am joined by my colleagues, Emily Jerome, Thea Evans, Lindsay Eichner from the county, and Zoli Godden-Dalton. For the sake of moving us along, I'm going to do the presentation and we're all available for answering questions. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Can you see that okay? You guys disappeared. So
you're not sharing currently.
I'm not sharing?
Correct.
Really? Okay. How about now?
Now you are. Looks great.
Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to minimize this. Thank you for your patience. And we're going to try to keep our presentation brief tonight. We are mostly going to walk you through attachment D in your packet. We wanted to be able to focus on the public testimony that we've received on urban reserves. And we've been pretty thoughtful with it and have written up a fairly lengthy response to some of the testimony. That's attachment D. And so that's mostly what we're going to go through and welcome your questions. Before we do that, we want to remind everybody where we are in the process. We are in our formal adoption process. So you can see all of these check marks indicating our process and project accomplishments along the way. Really, we started back here in project initiation in 2018, working with the county on urban reserves, going through our detailed technical analysis and then our more nuanced suitability analysis and getting direction from decision makers back in 2020 on our proposed urban reserves. So we've been undergoing our adoption process since then, where we've completed an adoption package. And back in September, we issued 4,000 mailed notices to folks in and around the urban reserve area. We've held work sessions with both planning commissions. We've held a joint public meeting back in October. And last week we had a Lane County Planning Commission deliberations where they issued a recommendation to the Board of Commissioners. Tonight we're meeting with you and requesting your recommendation. And after the first of the year, probably starting in February, we will start with public meetings again with the Board of Commissioners and the City Council. So that's where we've been and where we're going. So tonight, so this meeting was postponed in part because we got some really good public input. We worked hard to address it, and really in the numbers, it wasn't that great. We got about 43 members of the public who've contacted the city and the county so far, which included 18 folks with questions and 25 people who provided testimony, either at the public hearing or in writing. So tonight we're going to walk through the city and county staff response to that testimony and proposed recommendations. So like I said, that last batch of testimony, it's included in your packet as attachment C. Tonight we're focusing on attachment D, which is the staff response to the public testimony. So the memo begins with responses to more general questions, including 2 questions from planning commissioners at the public hearing related to annexation and the impacts of urban reserves on property owners. Staff researched these questions to provide more thorough answers than we were able to provide at the hearing, and we included additional information in the memo, which I hope you've had a chance to review. But for the sake of time, I'm going to focus our discussion on the public testimony, but I'm happy to answer any specific questions you have about that. That you can find on the first page of the memo in attachment D. So the first 2 questions, the public testimony on the first page is from a member of the public, and those questions are focused on how farmland is evaluated in our analysis and whether the urban reserves analysis is detailed enough. It's on page 2 of the memo. So while staff understands the limitations of the analysis may feel frustrating, the urban reserves analysis considers farmland really to the extent that's allowed by state law. And I'm going to give a really high level answer. Lindsay is here from the county. She's an excellent resource on any detailed questions you have, because this is county land. So we can't consider land that is farmed on rural residential designated land as agricultural land, because the county has already designated it for future housing. If that's not already how it's being used, it's designated for residential. So we can only consider farmland that's on land the county has designated for agriculture. So we get questions for folks who have micro farms on rural residential designated properties and why we aren't considering their farmland as farmland, because that's how they consider it. And that's just part of the nuances of state law, not just urban reserves, but Oregon's land use law in general. So that said, The 27-year option on which the proposed urban reserves is based was selected mainly to avoid including the best agricultural land that was in the study area. So this is land with the highest value soils in order to preserve it for farming. So we go into more detail on that answer in page 1 and 2 of the memo. So the second question about how detailed is the urban reserve analysis? We periodically get questions like this. And again, our analysis is guided by state rules. So while by necessity it's at high level, due to the size of the study area at about 27,000 acres of land that we had to evaluate, it's also quite detailed in our technical analysis, which is documented, excuse me, in the adoption package. So, for example, the land need and land supply analysis is based on actual development trends and on adopted documents from the 2018 UGB expansion analysis. To adequately analyze the land further, we split the study area into 18 sub-areas and developed a consistent suitability analysis for each, which is also included in the adoption package. These reports average about 25 pages, and from our experience, this is a much more robust urban reserve analysis than many communities around the state have undertaken, not to mention the rigorous public involvement process along the way. So that's a quick touch on the level of detail used in our analysis, but I'm happy to discuss any more specific components that you may have questions about. So public testimony number 2 is on page 3. It is from a member of the public who has property just outside of the proposed urban reserves. They questioned why their property isn't included in the urban reserves when it appears similar to other nearby properties that are included. So this property is shown here. This slide on the left shows Goal 5 wetlands, and this slide on the right, where their property is, shows 100-year floodplain in that dashed green. So there's been a lengthy email exchange with this property owner. The correspondence is included in the first and second batch of testimony. And this land on the map here is located at the northeast corner of the intersection of Barger Drive and Green Hill Road. It was studied as part of the Clear Lake sub-area suitability analysis report. And as described more fully there, the subject property, along with 2 adjacent lots, was identified as unsuitable for urban reserves because it's almost entirely encumbered by the 100-year floodplain, as you can see here, and by Goal 5 adopted wetlands. And it actually includes no developable acres as part of our analysis. So there's some discussion in the testimony of whether the property is truly undevelopable and how we define that. And staff acknowledges that some of the land identified in the study as undevelopable or unsuitable could potentially be developed in the future. However, urban reserves planning analyzes whether urban levels of development should be directed on land in the future based on land's current official designations and mapping. So due to the extent of the natural resource and natural hazard constraints that have been mapped on the land and the location of it on the edge of the proposed urban reserves in an area where it's not needed to aid in service provision to other adjacent land, its inclusion in urban reserves is not justified. So excluding this property is consistent with the analysis as there are other properties in the urban reserve study area with similar conditions that were identified also as unsuitable for urban reserves. And I'm happy to, I'm going to hold questions until I'm done with the presentation, then I'm happy to go back and answer anything specific about any of these, because I'm really sort of going over just the high level pieces and not into the detail. Testimony number 3 is on page 5 of the memo. It is a letter from a property owner, the Wildish Land Company, or Sand and Gravel Company, they go by both, with a follow-up letter from one of their staff people describing their sand and gravel operation and why 3 of their properties within the proposed urban reserve should be excluded from urban reserves. And these emails are included in both batch 2 and 3 testimony that you've received. The map here on this slide and on page 6 of the memo, I believe, shows the property they own in the Mackenzie sub area. That's all of these dashed lines is all of their land holdings, with the 3 subject properties outlined in light blue, right here, and right here. Most of their property, the rest that's not outlined, was already determined to be unsuitable for urban reserves. Those properties that you can see that are in salmon, that are outlined in pink, were identified as suitable originally. So based on the information submitted by Wildish, staff believes that the 3 tax lots shown on the map outlined in light blue, which total 17.7 developable acres outside of the UGB, were analyzed incorrectly in our draft study. City and county staff have discussed it with them and with each other, and we recommend changes in the urban reserve study that result in a determination that the outlined portion of this land is actually not suitable for urban reserves. These changes would primarily be made in the Mackenzie suitability analysis report, and the property would not be included in the proposed urban reserves. So here's a little bit of our reasoning from the memo. In their letter, Wildish describes these properties as critical components for their ongoing active mining operation on their adjacent properties, which are part of a Dogami operating permit. That's the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. This is a permit for surface mining operations from the state. Some of the information important for staff's reconsideration is the fact that of their approximately 11,080 acre operation, they attest that only about 85 acres have been fully mined in the past 50 plus years, and that available sand and gravel reserves at the site are estimated to be more than 100 million tons yet, with the site having a life expectancy of at least 100 years with continuous operations. The urban reserve study, as currently written, assumed that these edge properties would be available for urban development by the end of the urban reserves planning period, which is 2059. So according to Wildish, tax lots 703, oh, that's 1600, 703 right here, and 1600 are utilized in their day-to-day operations of the mine, while tax lot 800, which is split in and out of the UGB, is currently used as a noise, dust, and security buffer for their mining operations. All are part of these ongoing mining operations, which the property owner attests will be active well beyond 2059. So in addition, these lands, while they're small, they help act as a buffer to minimize impacts to current and future neighbors, as they're on the edge of the UGB between developed neighborhoods and these mining operations. Given this additional information from Wildish, we have found that these lands are not suitable for future residential or employment uses by 2059, and therefore recommend removing these tax lots as described from the proposed urban reserves. This is the suitable lands map for the Mackenzie sub area, and it shows the 3 properties that would be removed. So the next public testimony is 4 and 5. It's on page 8 of the memo. It includes a variety of wetland related questions, including how Goal 5 protected wetlands were determined, whether staff were categorizing wetlands correctly, and how we account for wetlands in our analysis. These emails are all included in the batch 3 testimony. There's a few different emails, I believe, maybe 2 different emails covering these questions. I'm going to discuss the first 2 bullets together. And then go back to the third. So based on this inquiry, city and county staff have had extensive conversations, and we have identified an error in the way in which wetlands were described in the urban reserves analysis. We propose to correct the way in which wetlands are described and shown. So specifically on the slide here, the current wetlands description in the urban reserve study and technical memo is this first bullet. Lane County Goal 5 adopted wetlands from the National Wetlands Inventory, which we also call the NWI, or wetlands designated as protected in the West Eugene Wetlands Plan. So that's how we're currently describing the wetlands in urban reserves. The proposed change is to change the text to Lane County Goal 5 adopted wetlands, wetlands on the National Wetlands Inventory, and wetlands designated as protect or restore in the West Eugene Wetlands Plan. So here's the here's the reasoning and the nuance there. We incorrectly characterized the National Wetlands Inventory, NWI, as proxy for the Lane County Goal 5 adopted wetlands. While Lane County uses the NWI map to send notice to the State Division of State Lands for applicable protection measures, but the only wetlands within the proposed urban reserves that can be correctly characterized as Goal 5 adopted wetlands are on the adopted Goal 5 map from 2004 for the area inside the Metro Plan and outside the UGB. So it's a little technical, but we intend to update the analysis maps to ensure that the reference to wetlands are corrected and that all of the Lane County Goal 5 adopted wetlands are included in the urban reserves analysis. So these changes won't end up changing the proposed location or amount of our urban reserves. So it doesn't ultimately change the proposed urban reserves, but the corrections will require fairly extensive edits throughout the technical analysis, including this text, which runs throughout, and I mentioned those 18 different suitability analysis reports. It's in there, it's in our study, it's in our technical analysis. And on our maps, we have new wetlands maps with only a few changes, but they still all need to be changed. So the urban reserve study text and maps will be changed also with this fix. So I'm jumping back to this last slide to answer this last question. Is our analysis treating wetlands correctly? The bottom line is yes. but the response is complicated. So it's on page 9. Oh, I said it's on page 8. Verify. Is on page 8 and page 9. So the testimony argues that there are many more potential wetlands on land in the proposed urban reserves that haven't been identified on these wetland maps that we're using, and that in practical terms, they might actually not be able to be developed. So why are we counting them as developable? The argument is that these lands may have potential wetlands, and so they should also not be counted as developable in the urban reserves analysis. It's actually the opposite of the earlier testimony where the property owner had Goal 5 wetlands on their property and they wanted that to be counted as developable. This is saying there may be other wetlands. And so, as described in the analysis, urban reserves doesn't assign development capacity to any land on this list that we have come up with based on state guidance of undevelopable land, which includes wetlands, but it's not limited to it. The study didn't and wasn't required to consider whether additional land may include wetlands that aren't identified in the inventories that are discussed here. So we acknowledge that all land has trade-offs, and urban reserves weighed all of the factors that were allowable by state law to evaluate overall the best land to include. And as we get more and more focused in on smaller areas of land at the time of the UGB expansion analysis, we will further refine this work as it's appropriate to do. Okay, so the last piece of testimony we wanted to talk about tonight was number 6, that is on page 9 of the memo. It's a question about big game habitat and why the urban reserves analysis did not take this into consideration. This is also included in your batch 3 testimony. So since we began urban reserves planning, we had considered and dismissed using big game habitat as an undevelopable habitat type when we considered this list of undevelopable land back in 2018 and 2019. But since that time, the counties has become involved in addressing a remand from the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals that raises new questions about the protection measures that should be applied to big game habitat outside of the Metro Plan boundary. So big game habitat is deer and elk, and it covers most of Eugene's South Hills in and around the city and its urban growth boundary. So you can see from this map over here, this is our study area, and you can see the intersection of big game habitat with the southern half of our study area. These maps are from the 80s from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they cover about 40% or approximately 11,000 acres of our study area. Arguably, the city and county could have determined that these big game habitat areas outside of the Metro Plan boundary are undevelopable and therefore not among the acres that could serve as part of the 27-year supply of urban reserves developable land. However, that's not the course that we took in the urban reserves analysis. That's partially because the county Goal 5 study that identified this habitat is more than 35 years old, and ODF's mapping and recommendations have changed significantly since then. Staff doesn't recommend that big game habitat identified on the county maps be considered undevelopable for purposes of urban reserves analysis. Instead, staff recommends that the study be revised to include a discussion of this big game habitat, particularly in, or only really in those 7 suitability analysis reports where the habitat is present in the southern half of our study area. The presence of this big game habitat will be noted and evaluated as part of locational factor 3, which is environmental consequences. This evaluation will be part of the basis for the determination of whether certain lands in the study area are unsuitable for future urban development. Due to the fact that there are significant environmental constraints that have already been taken into consideration on lands in the study area encompassing the South Hills, the consideration of big game habitat won't result in a change to the proposed urban reserves. Then, as land is considered for UGB expansion, the city and county will update the Goal 5 work related to big game habitat. Okay, so that was a lot of talking, and I thank you for your patience. I wanted to flash that and remind folks what's included in the adoption package, which is in attachment B. All of the links are in attachment B of your AIS. So the complete adoption package includes our draft ordinances, the City of Eugene and county ordinance, plus plan amendments, 11 different intergovernmental agreements, and our extensive legal findings, which include a public engagement summary, our Eugene Urban Reserve study, which include those suitability reports, our Eugene Urban Reserves technical memo, and our complete list of tax lots. So tonight, staff recommends moving forward with the proposed Eugene Urban Reserves as described in this adoption package with a few changes. With respect to the land proposed to be included in urban reserves, staff recommends the removal of 17.7 developable acres that are part of the Wildish Company's very long-term gravel mining plan, as described in the staff memo in attachment D. With the removal of that land, there would be an urban reserve of 5,900 developable acres, which is still a 27-year urban reserve. In addition, staff is also recommending making some revisions to the material that support the proposed urban reserves in response to the public testimony received, also as described in attachment D. These changes relate to the material's characterization of wetlands and its treatment of big game habitat. So this slide here is a summary of the proposed changes to the urban reserves adoption package, which is more fully described in the motion on page 4 of your AIS. Next steps. So this should actually be like last steps and next steps. Last week, the Lane County Planning Commission, as I mentioned, they unanimously recommended that the Lane County Board of Commissioners approve the urban reserves adoption package with the changes as presented in the AIS. Tonight, the Eugene Planning Commission considers making a recommendation on the urban reserves adoption package to the Eugene City Council. Following, staff would make recommended changes with public meetings beginning again in February. These are tentatively scheduled right now with the board and the city council. We're hoping for a joint public hearing on February 28th. And that's all I have for you. Thank you for participating tonight and for your time. I'll now turn the meeting back to Chair Isaacson, and I'm happy to stop talking for a moment and hear from you. And any of us are happy to answer any questions you may have. I'm going to unshare as well.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think you're going to be talking a little bit more as the first question goes to Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you, Chair Isaacson. And thanks, Rebecca. I really appreciate all of the time you all have spent on addressing the public testimony. That's I just really appreciate that. My question regarding the Silberstein's property and their interest in being part of the urban reserves, I'm wondering if there's a separate process that they could go through that could potentially change that for them, that's outside of this adoption process, that might then, you know, because this is identifying urban reserves. This is not expanding a UGB. However,
Right.
so it doesn't make, you know, we're not putting anybody inside the UGB through this process. But I'm just curious, is if it sounds like you touched on it, but you know, going from urban reserves identifying to formal adoption of a UGB expansion, is there something else that this property owner might be able to do as far as a process that they could go through that could then have them be considered if a future adoption were to be, you know, a decision that's before this body and council or whatnot?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start, and I welcome Emily or Lindsay or anyone else to jump in. Urban reserves aren't the only land that are considered when we need to expand the urban growth boundary. They're the first priority land that we consider. So we are able to consider other land. This land, I believe, is designated agricultural, so it would not be a high priority land to consider. But if its characteristics change at that point, if there are determining factors that might make it more appropriate to be included in the UGB at that time, then that would certainly be the time for it to be considered.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Commissioner Bailey.
Thank you. I have 2 or 3 questions, and one concerns that same property. But first, thank you, Rebecca, for your amazing amount of work in this over the years and everything you have put together. I really appreciate that. That same property, you had a map that showed the FEMA 100-year floodplain.
Mm-hmm.
And this property was at the northeast corner of Barger and Green Hill. The southeast corner of Barger and Green Hill is already an existing residential property development consisting of many homes and close by to the elementary school and the park. And it obviously was or is also part of the FEMA 100-year floodplain and was probably also wetlands at the time of its development, which is within the last 25 years. I'm close to that neighborhood and my home is 22 years old. So it makes the question of quote unquote developable a little bit of a moot point to me, because development has happened and could again.
Sure.
I don't know if that existing development is incorporated in the city or not, or, you know, in the boundary.
Am I sharing this screen?
Yes.
Again?
Yes.
Okay. So, so this is the map that we're talking about. Yeah, our floodplain map doesn't show floodplain in the city limits. It only shows, it doesn't show floodplain or anything else within the city limits. So it is a good guess that there were portions of floodplain in the city limits before some of this neighborhood was developed. And we acknowledge that our treatment of 100-year floodplain and of wetlands is different in urban reserves than how we're currently treating it inside the city limits. That's because we're looking at where does it make sense to direct urbanization, to say this area makes sense to urbanize in the future when we have 27,000 acres of land to analyze. So we determined, because of climate change and because of growth needs, but also environmental impacts, that it didn't make sense to funnel future growth onto 100-year floodplain for the purposes of urban reserves analysis only. Even though we have built on some floodplain inside the city limits, and even though our regulations are different inside the city limits, we're looking at where we want our growth to go in the future. And so that's part of the answer. The other part is that some of these areas, you can see some of these salmon colored areas that we are proposing for urban reserves also have some floodplain on them, but they also have land that doesn't have floodplain. So they also have more developable land, so that you could, sorry, where'd my cursor go? So that you could sensitively do development on these properties, avoiding the most potentially hazardous land and most expensive, because people would have to pay more to build lands, to build homes there because of flood insurance. So you could still build on these larger parcels and avoid that floodplain. So we didn't remove all of the land with floodplain from urban reserves, only those lands that really where it completely covered the property, or it made the property in such a way so that it was very difficult or expensive to develop or to serve.
All right.
Can I just want to jump in there and just say, with respect to that question, I think it's hard for some property owners to see us using the term undevelopable with their property. Yeah. When in reality, they may be able to develop the property. Floodplain, right. It just creates higher standards for the building on the property. Wetlands, you know, in some cases, delineations change, they move. So I just wanted to say that, you know, remember these findings are derived entirely from the law that tells us how we must and how we cannot do urban reserves. And the term developable comes from the law. And that is why we use that term. It doesn't mean, it shouldn't flag a piece of property as being like technically undevelopable in the future. It's just not land that we are going to rely on to meet development needs in the future.
Yes, I understand. And my next question is about testimony 1 about the residential parcels where people are doing small farms. And yep. I know the responses to that explained why the determination was made the way it was. But just the way Commissioner Edwards asked about, you know, could the property owner, do they have any recourse? I wonder about, there are so many of these small farm owners on Bloomberg Road and the brick communication. Do they have any recourse? Is there any, I didn't understand totally the conversation about rezoning. if they wanted to try and get it rezoned as farmland and therefore excluded, would that all have to happen before the adoption of the urban reserves, or is there no option for that at all? Could they possibly be appealing to the Oregon Land Use Board of Appeals that you mentioned? You know, is there any other way out to protect those little farms?
So nobody's going to require those farms to develop is the first thing I would like to say. Even if those areas come into urban reserves first, there's no one is going to require any changes of use on those properties. In fact, urban reserves wants to hold those uses as they currently are. Lindsay can probably speak to the issue of rezoning from or redesignating from rural residential to agricultural, because I know she has some stats on that. You want to jump in on that, Lindsay?
Yes, good evening, commissioners. Lindsay Eichner from the county. So we have actually not ever successfully done a plan amendment zone change from residential land to farm or forest land. We've had one application many years ago and it stalled because we weren't able to make positive findings. I don't actually think it made it past the Lane County Planning Commission. So I would agree with Rebecca that we would encourage them to continue their farm use on their property. It's hard to go back, because when we adopted our comprehensive plan in 1984, we looked at the whole county and determined that there were certain properties that were already they're already committed to residential use or commercial use or industrial use. And so we went through what's called an exception process to the statewide planning goals. And so these rural residentially zoned properties we've already taken exception to the farm and forest goals and determined that they were at that point committed to residential use. Now, maybe they were doing farming at that time, or if they've started farming since 84, because that was a while ago now. And that's okay, because farming is an allowed use in that zone. So we want to continue to support them, but it's not easy to change that zoning.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. And my last question, I don't know, you may have addressed this already, but as part of the urban reserves, is there any inclusion of priorities or some indication of what would be used first, what would be used second? You know, what can
Right,
we?
that's a good question.
Yeah.
There is not. There is not. For urban reserves, we are just holding this land in reserve and waiting to see what we may need it for, if anything, in the future. So that determination comes with our UGB expansion analysis. What type of land we might need more of, what type of uses on the land. And then we look at these areas in urban reserves for those specific type of uses that we've identified a need for. So right now these lands are simply held in reserve.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Ferguson.
Thank you. I have a quick follow-up question to Commissioner Bailing. Questions. I guess I feel like there are some properties that are being farmed within the current urban growth boundary, like in the Santa Clara area. Okay, I see people shaking their heads. Yes. Is there any type of city ordinance that limits the activity that they can do in that regard as far as farming goes?
I'm looking at Alyssa. She
Yeah,
knew
I
I
think
was, she knew I was looking.
I know,
at
it depends on what type of farming. So we do have limits to animal keeping. So, if they're gonna run a head of cattle, that might be problematic. In terms of crops, I mean, there are, in the River Road area, particularly Santa Clara, there are crops growing. I can't think of any limitations that we have, honestly, that we have on farming as it pertains to crops.
Okay, great, because I had thought there were some in that part of the city. So that was just
Lindsay just had her hand up, so I wasn't sure if she had something.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought I would add to that. I didn't speak to this before, and I should have mentioned it, that the rural residential zone does have a limitation on animals per acre, depending on the type of animal, which I think it's probably not exactly the same as in the urban growth boundary, but it's somewhat similar. So we do allow crops, and they could potentially have a home occupation to have a farm stand to sell their crops off of their property. But there are some limitations on number of animals.
Okay, great. Thanks for that follow-up. I just want to say I have found this process, well, I mean, this process is already governed by pretty detailed, rigorous laws in the state. And I've found the city's urban reserve planning, excuse me, to identify an appropriate supply of land for reserves to be rigorous. And I really appreciate staff addressing and taking the time to delay the process to address the public input in such detail, plus making the changes that you've discussed tonight and detailed. I am primarily ready to move forward with a recommendation, but did want to clarify for myself the changes that were made for the wetlands and the big game habitat. They don't essentially make changes to the reserves. They make changes to the analysis maps and the reserve study. But it sounds to me like when we do move to that UGB adoption phase and implement some of those priorities that Commissioner Bailing was asking about, some of these lands may at that point be considered less prioritized, or some of these changes that are being made could at that point potentially reduce the available land to adopt. Is that correct?
Potentially. We would have to do an analysis of those goal 5 resources on properties and identify how that impacted the future developability of that land. So yes, as we are kind of zooming in on property, we have a higher threshold of needed analysis to identify types of uses, density of uses, those types of things.
Okay, great.
And I know my colleagues want to jump in on that. Okay.
Commissioner Beeson.
Thanks. So I also am ready to approve a recommendation that we send this on to the council. I have a couple of comments. I want to say, first off, I mean, and I'm going to echo a couple of people here, but appreciation and appreciation to the staff, everybody who's worked on this. It's gone on a number of years. It's been going on the 4 years that I've been on this commission. We've had a number of sessions on it. And I think what I've done a lot of learning. I think I also found here, as we were kind of coming in over the last few months. This material is very well organized and very comprehensive. And I found that I was able to navigate my way through it and address some of the questions I had. And I particularly was focused on some of this testimony that came in late, or came not late, but came in here, the batch 3 and so on, and particularly some of that from Bill Close. Was able to go in and get a pretty clear picture of how you'd handled it. So, and as Commissioner Fragala said, and I think it's been observed in the material, we're following prescribed state statutes and regulations, and I don't want to say we're constrained, but I think we followed them pretty carefully. And I also definitely appreciated the attachment to the AIS this time, the memo from staff, and you went through it in detail again tonight. I also appreciate that. The particular testimony that was received, I mean, some was pretty compelling. Some of it caused us to make some changes here. And I think in going through that, I found I was able to go through it and understand that pretty clearly. And I would think interested members of the public, it's a good resource to have there. Maybe even particularly the urban reserve analysis, or the study that's referenced a number of times. I think that's a document that's good for people to take a look at if they haven't already. And particularly, I think as the decision makers begin to get this, there's a lot of material here to help. I think I also want to say the public process, in my mind, has, I don't want to understate it, but it has been very thorough. It's gone on for a couple of years for sure. And in my mind, there has been a lot done to make sure that interested people, property owners and others have, and people affected by this in one way or another, have had a chance. They've been given information or provided information, given an opportunity to review and comment, and I think have the issues addressed pretty clearly. Now, I know I'm kind of saying that from my position sitting here at the table, but I do believe that process has been really thorough. I believe it was also recognized by the state as being comprehensive, if I'm remembering right. We received some acknowledgement of that. So it's gone on, we've had all of the different review, and it's been done in accordance with the laws. I guess the only other thing, briefly, I think most everything else has kind of been covered. I particularly like, if I've got my attachments straight, you had a couple of attachments to the most recent AIS. The attachment E, the owner's matrix, and it was in response to Commissioner Lear's question. But I would refer that to anybody listening or who checks in on this as we go through. That's a very clear, I think, representation of the various status points of a piece of property in this process and what they'd be required to comply with or not. And I think it really kind of, if you get into it, it really kind of addresses what I think are a lot of these questions. So I think that's, I would say, I just think that is very good. That's really my comments. Again, I guess at this point, I would be ready to support a recommendation to go forward. And I just want to say to you all, very good work. Thanks.
I want to throw myself in the mix. Thanks, Commissioner Beatson, and thanks staff for the presentation. I appreciate that. I only have one question regarding wetland mitigation banks. So right now, there's kind of an ebb and flow in wetland mitigation credits that are readily available. Will this new urban reserve impact the amount of credits we have, plus or minus? Will it require any mitigation credits that we're opening the land up? If you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, it does not impact wetland mitigation to that level of detail. It's not, because as this land is in urban reserves, it doesn't change what people can already do on their land. So when it's still in the county as urban reserves, if that land comes into the UGB and is identified for future development and there may be wetlands on that land, then similar to the industrial land that was brought into the UGB for the last expansion, then I'm not familiar with the details of it, but then those wetlands need to be taken into consideration. Does Emily? Okay.
I was gonna say, I guess what I'm asking is, you know, you have, this is like the next queued up area of the city that homeowners are likely to know that at some point this land is going to move into the city at some point. And so if you have land that has wetland on it, you know, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the state, everyone who gets involved in the wetland process with the mitigation is going to be looking at whether or not this is land that needs to be developed or not, whether it's next in line. And so it raises the specter of it will be developed at some point. It will fall into needing credits at some point. So I guess what I'm asking is not necessarily does it affect the immediate credit availability, but more longer term as the state looks to where we're going to mitigate credits from, where we're going to improve the wetlands that already exist. What is the thought process on the impact of adding more potential wetlands to get the development we're hoping for within the reserves that we're expanding? And, you know, where are we going to get those credits?
Right. Might it impact wetland delineation and credits in the future? I can't speak in detail about how the city has done it before, and maybe Alyssa or Emily can, but I know that that we will be taking that into consideration if we expand into areas with wetlands for the UGB expansion. And the city did also create a new wetland mitigation bank in the last few years to mitigate future wetlands. And so that is something that we would have to work with the county and the state on if we were to get to the next step after urban reserves. If we were to expand into areas with wetlands, that would be part of the work that we would need to do.
Yeah, I would only add, you know, Commissioner Isaacson, you're alluding to the answer, I think, in your very own question. And in that one of the benefits of this kind of very long range planning is to flag those kinds of things. And so I would think that the agencies that the city works with for mitigation banking and wetland regulation and that they now can have a better idea of where it does make sense and how much wetland development we're likely to see. It could be that when we get to UGB expansion, we learn, we do a new delineation, or we examine in much closer detail where those wetlands are, and we probably will consider that obviously much more seriously at that point in time, and whether or not it makes sense to go in an area that is really heavy in wetland. But at this point, it does flag a pretty obvious need to stay in that business of mitigation banking and to look in places that to look for more areas that we can use for that program.
Understood. Thank you. Commissioner Ramey.
Thank you. This is one of those moments in the work of a citizen where one feels pretty good about the state of affairs. I haven't followed this process very closely, but I know enough about it. I know enough about the concepts behind it to think that the city of Eugene and the county, and particularly the state of Oregon, are really on the right track. Thinking long-term strategies, all the issues that have been raised today. I don't need to go over them again, but in particular, I was greatly interested in the ebbs and flows of the wetlands mitigations. So I think that would be a wonderful title of a poem or something, how wetland mitigation ebbs and flows from time to time. With that, I of course will support this. Wonderful work by the staff. As I said, I wasn't that tuned into it to begin with, but I've learned a lot as we've gone through it. I greatly appreciate, in particular, the detail that you took, understanding the public comment, and then reflecting that back to us and sort of walking us through what you did about it, and in a way that we could all understand it. So greatly appreciated. Once again, terrific work by the staff. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Commissioner Lear.
Yes, like Commissioner Bueling, I come in at the end of this process. It's obviously been an extremely long, complex and technical process, but I really did appreciate, to echo some of the other comments, that I thought the background materials presented really gave me a good sense of, why the decisions were made, how the research and technical analysis was done, how the outreach was conducted. And just to parrot Commissioner Ramey, I was particularly impressed with, your responsiveness to the testimony that came in at our last hearing on the matter, and how thoroughly it was evaluated, and how it changed some of the recommendations really rapidly, even though some of it was new information. So it's tough to say anyone who hasn't been part of this could really be an expert on it. But I definitely feel extremely comfortable with the work that everyone has done. And I only wish that some of the members of the public that did express concern, maybe were able to have a little more individual interaction to kind of understand that, especially with regard to the small farms, that the usage and the value of their property and its character isn't going to change as a result of the inclusion based on these kind of abstract suitability specifications that are really coming from the state. So just in agreement with the other commissioners that have spoken, thanks for the excellent work and for keeping us so well informed about it, and happy to enthusiastically support your work in the proposal.
Okay, any other comments from any other commissioners? Okay, I don't see any, so I think that we are ready for a recommendation. Commissioner Fregula.
Sure, I will take a stab at this half-a-page recommendation. I recommend that the Eugene City I recommend that the Planning Commission move to recommend that the Eugene City Council approve the Urban Reserves package as presented in Attachment B to this memo with the following changes. Revise the urban reserve study, technical analysis, and related urban reserve maps to incorporate the information and determinations described in public testimony, section 3 of the memo dated November 29th, 2022, entitled Staff Responses to Public Testimony and Planning Commission Questions, resulting in the removal of 17.7 acres of developable land owned by Wildish for sand and gravel operations from the proposed urban reserves, and revise the urban reserve study, technical analysis, and related urban reserve maps to incorporate the information and determinations described in public testimony section 4 of the memo dated November 29th, 2022, entitled Staff Response to Public Testimony and Planning Commission Questions, to correct text and maps related to Lane County's Goal 5 wetlands, and revise the urban reserve study to incorporate the information about big game habitat described in public testimony section 6 of the memo dated November 29th, 2022, entitled Staff Response to Public Testimony and Planning Commission Questions.
Do I have a second?
Can I second? Can I second without repeating it all?
Yes. Would you like to speak to the motion, Commissioner Bergla?
No, I refer to my earlier comments.
Understood. Then we'll just call the question. All those in favor of the motion on the table signify by raising your hand. Motion passes unanimously. Staff, please reflect. All right, so turning it over to Alyssa for subcommittee assignments is next on our agenda. Alyssa.
Excellent. And thank you for your work on urban reserves. That was awesome. Also great to hear the recognition of staff, because they really have put in a tremendous amount of work in the entire analysis package, community outreach, all of the above. So thank you for that. In terms of the subcommittees, I emailed you all this morning a PDF that kind of has the first cut based on what you all had interest in. Some of them, there was more interest than others, and so we had to make some choices. And I want to let you know, this is an informal process, so you all can, negotiate, bargain if you have some concerns. I wanted to let you know, I wanted to walk through a couple of them and explain where there might be some future options as well for those of you who had interest and maybe didn't make it on one of the subcommittees. So let me just walk through those pretty quickly. So for the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee, or ETAC, Commissioner Edwards is currently the chair of that. I know there was some interest from some other folks, but we'd like to keep her on as the current chair. There will be some openings, some at-large openings for that committee that will be advertised early next year. And we have in the past had two planning commissioners, one wearing their planning commissioner hat and one wearing a different hat. And so I wanted to let you know that that's absolutely an option, and I will let you know when that opportunity, I think it's going to be on the same timeline as all of the boards and commissions for the city. So I'll let you know about that one. Human Rights Commission, I think what we'll do here, unless somebody's really, really interested or is now interested, I'll go ahead and continue to monitor their agendas. And if there is something that seems to kind of intersect with the Planning Commission, I will let you know about that. And then the two that I think had the most interest were the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities implementation and the housing and UGB analysis. And I will say for both of those, we're still really scoping out what those projects are going to be. There's multiple components to them. So for the climate friendly right now, parking is probably the most prominent component, and then we'll need some assistance on climate friendly areas. But there are some future phases, or I wouldn't call them phases, components as well. And so it may be that we actually break this up into multiple project resource groups. So I have a feeling we will probably do that, just because that would be a lot to ask, because some of these are going to be happening at the same time. Right now, we just need the one group. And so I think that works out. And then for the housing UGB update, so I got a typo in there. It's House Bill 2003 implementation. That also has a number of components kind of under one umbrella. So we'll be updating our buildable lands inventory. There'll be housing capacity analysis. We'll be looking at a number of things. So it's also possible that we break that one up into different project resources as well. I think that's all I wanted to mention about those. I guess actually one more thing. I will go ahead and notify the staff, so you don't need to reach out to the staff. Once there's agreement, I will go ahead and let them know, because some of these will start either sending you agendas if they're another board and commission, or folks will reach out to you eventually. The other thing, just real quick, we do limit them to 3 people per group, because 4 makes it a quorum, which makes it a meeting of the Planning Commission. So that's why these are limited to 3. If somebody's not going to be able to make one of these subcommittee meetings, then we've got an alternate available to fill in that spot. So normally what we do, I think if people have some concerns or are willing to, I don't know, I'm going to throw it back to you all to figure out how you want to negotiate or bargain this list, or if you're fine with it.
Commissioner Edwards has a question.
Thank you. So Alyssa, so I'm going to ask you about the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood plan. When I responded, I believe, and maybe I miscommunicated this, but given my professional role, knowing that there are components of that plan that actually have a direct impact to me professionally. So I had thought that it was best for me to step completely down from that. And I noticed that I was put in, and then Lisa's now the alternate. That was not my intention. So I want to put it out there. I think that it's getting to this point in the process. Because I've been the alternate, I've been sort of at on the sidelines, but now that we're at this really kind of critical point, I just wanted to, make that clear delineation between my planning commission role and my LTD role. So I'm just going to put that out there, that I would think that it might be best. We don't have any more attorneys on here that maybe.
No,
but
that makes absolute sense, Commissioner Edwards. And I think we just slid you over because that was Commissioner Taylor originally.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and so there was a vacancy, and as the alternate, we slid you into it. And it makes complete sense why that probably isn't a group that you would want to participate in that role. So yes. I understand. Commissioner Fregula, are you interested in being more than an alternate for River Road?
I think I would prefer to see if there was any other interest on it. I'm happy to serve as the alternate. I have recently added some things to my schedule, which I'm not sure if it would impact my participation in that committee.
And I will say, this is one of the few on this list that's actually wrapping up. It should be wrapping up in 2023. And so a lot of it will be kind of getting ready for the adoption. I'm not sure it's going to be super meeting heavy, I guess is my point. It's more kind of responding to maybe what we're planning to do for outreach.
Well, if there isn't someone else who's interested, I won't commit to it tonight, but I would need to have a conversation with you first about it.
Okay. I think that's fair.
Now, Alyssa, are you looking for an adoption of this, or do you want maybe?
No, the great part is it's just informal. It's not, I don't think you need to vote on it. So I think it's more just, some head nods, and then Commissioner Fregula and I can follow up about the River Road neighborhood plan.
And I will say, yes, the neighborhood plan is just about wrapped up, and I think we're on our 6th year. So hopefully 2023 is the year we wrap it up. If we do that, then that means that I will be down to only one assignment. As you mentioned, it's not going to be super meeting heavy. We don't have any liaison to the Human Rights Commission. I'd be happy to volunteer to do that, or at least have a conversation about what the kind of commitment would be. Let's start with that. Let's talk offline about what that commitment is. I want to know.
Okay. Absolutely.
And if that doesn't fit, we can figure something else out. If somebody else needs assistance as well, I'm happy to kind of step up into that. So other than that, I would ask other folks to look at the assignments, see if there's any changes they want, and either email staff or myself, and we will discuss it.
The other thing I just wanted to mention, and we mentioned this kind of before the meeting started, for those of you who were on the call, for the land acknowledgement statement, we had planned to make kind of a rotating list, and then just hadn't implemented that yet. So I think what I can do is actually work with the chair and vice chair to put together what that would look like, so that the majority of the planning commission would be the folks reading the land acknowledgement statement. So we can come back to you at the next meeting with that, or maybe in advance of the next meeting with that. So Chair Isaacson and Vice Chair Fregula, I'll reach out to you about that. Okay.
Great.
That way we don't have to do it ad hoc. Be a little more organized about that. Okay, great. And I'll send you an email, kind of with what I heard about the subcommittees, and just, you know, if anybody else has anything, they can respond to that email. I'll give you a prompt. Because I know we all have long to-do lists. And I think can I just roll into item C then? Yeah, okay, so yeah, great. So items from staff here. So this is your last meeting of 2022, which is kind of exciting. And so my New Year's resolution for you all is to start holding some in-person / hybrid meetings next year. So we have been working on that. It's been more complicated than I had hoped, just in terms of some technical details that I won't bore you with. But we are looking forward to getting that ball rolling in January, in fact. So not at your first meeting in January. We're going to keep that public hearing on January 10th on Zoom. And so that's the second public hearing for the Willamette Greenway code amendments. You received an email from Gabe about that. That notice has gone out, and so we had to put on the notice where it was going to be, and so we kept that one on Zoom. Our plan right now is for the January 24th meeting to have the Planning Commission meet in person, and then the public would be remote. And right now, well, it would be in the council work session room, which is on the 3rd floor of the downtown LCC building. You don't need to write this down right now. We'll send more information out to you. And typically we would serve dinner beforehand. That's what we did back in the pre-pandemic. And so that's the plan now. I will give you more information as we get closer to that and work through the rest of the details on that. I've mentioned before, state law requires that if there's a public meeting, that we do need to provide a remote option for folks. That there will not be public comment at that meeting, so it's totally fine that the public is not able to attend the meeting in person. But you all will finally get to be in the same room together, which I think is fantastic. And if you happen to be out of town, traveling, have a sick child, or you're sick, then you still can attend via Zoom, and that works out. I mean, don't attend if you're sick, honestly, but if there's another reason that you need to attend via Zoom, I think I'm gonna appreciate that flexibility. I sent you an email that had some February and some March meetings. As I mentioned, we're still working through what the climate friendly and the UGB update. We're kind of working through those work plans, and we'll have some more meetings to add in the upcoming months. And then I want to also finally get a retreat in there as well. Some of those dates, they're going to happen at certain times. So I want to work around what those dates are. And so again, another opportunity for an in-person meeting, which I think will be really rewarding. I think that's all that I have. Actually, real quick, I can't remember if we met since the city council took action on the clear and objective code amendments. They did ultimately approve those. And so those are, I assume they're on their way to Luba at some point here. All right. I think that's all that I have. So unless there's any questions for me.
Commissioner Fraggle.
Yeah, so with the adoption of the clear and objective code by the city council, isn't there a certain number of days that someone has to appeal it, and when does that date pass?
It is 21 days, and I don't remember the exact day. Those might have been, actually they were adopted on November 30th. So roughly 21 days. I can't remember if it's after the mayor signs. I'd have to look through it's typically after the mayor signs, I think. So before Christmas, we will know.
Great.
I think that's pretty much it. And it is the last meeting of 2022, and we'll see you all on January 10th in 2023.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right, meeting's adjourned. Thank you so much.
Good
Thanks
night.
all.